anytime you're working with a multicultural workforce, there's always going to be a variety of communication styles, right? There's also going to be a spectrum of trust.
Hello and welcome to the All Onboard Podcast, your go-to resource for all things employee onboarding. I'm your host, Thomas Kunjappu, founder and CEO of Cleary. Today, I am thrilled to welcome Allison Mairena, VP of People at New Globe. Allison has had a fascinating career journey from teaching English in China to leading HR initiatives in various organizations. So currently, as the VP of People at New Globe, Allison works on partnering with developing countries to bring educational content to schools, with a focus on onboarding specifically in Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, today, she's going to bring some unique insights, especially related to global onboarding, talent acquisition, and personal experiences in the field. So welcome to the show, Allison.
Thanks so much, Thomas.
Wonderful to have you. Let's start off with just going way early into your career and talk about how you go from teaching English in China to being the VP of People at New Globe.
At a high level, I did not get into HR thinking I was really hankering for a career in HR. At the time, I had just graduated from Florida State University, go Noles, with my degree in Italian and business. I had minored in Mandarin. And so my goal was to be an interpreter and get paid to just talk to people all the time. As it turns out, though, in order to get paid jobs to speak in other languages, you need to be able to speak them. And although my Italian was very fluent at that time, my Mandarin was substantially less. And I thought to myself, okay, the best way to get those language skills up to snuff would be immersion. And so I opted to get my teaching English as a foreign language certification, also from Florida State University. And I moved to Beijing to teach English to kids between the ages of 3 to 18. Love the little guys. And then that middle range, there's like a cutoff around 7 to 9 where I'm like, ooh, you're just being intentionally mischievous. And then it goes back to they'll listen to you again. So either way, I didn't go into it thinking, oh, wow, this is like the end all be all, but I really fell in love with education. And if you take a peek at my LinkedIn later, you'll see that education has really been kind of like the common theme throughout, even going back to my days in college. I sold educational books and software door to door. Then I taught English, right? And then from there, towards the end of my first year of teaching, I actually had an opportunity to transition, still with the same company, to move from Beijing to Shanghai and join the teacher recruitment and training team. That was like my first true postgraduate role, because the door-to-door sales internship was an internship, but I did recruiting for my own sales team there. So it wasn't my first rodeo in recruitment, my first real adult job in HR. And so in that transition in China, the company I was working for, EF Education First, did not have a traditional HR team. And in China, that teacher recruitment and training team really was all facets of HR, even though the heaviest focus was on that talent acquisition side. And so I was able to grow with them, become a senior recruiter, ended up relocating back to the US, but instead of heading home to Florida, I was able to end up in Boston. And I've been here in that area now for the past 10 years. And in that time, I've been able to maintain that connection to education mostly throughout. I jokingly say that I did my time in the staffing world, right? That's like the one company that wasn't like super mission driven. And the reason why I was there for a year was because I really missed being that true cultural evangelist for a mission I could get behind, and made my way back into corporate recruiting at Cengage, a very large ed tech, formerly publishing company. Then pivoted into the world of startups with early childhood tech. And then shortly before the pandemic and for 3.5 years subsequently, I was at a health tech startup called ConnectRN, growing them from Series A through pre-IPO. And now I'm at New Globe, where we're doing really exciting work in the education field. We're partnering with federal and state governments in developing economies to bring technology and curriculum into public schools. So the vast majority of our partners are in Sub-Saharan Africa and India.
Hey, it's Thomas here, Hope you're enjoying the episode so far. Are you curious to see how your onboarding program stacks up against the industry's best? Check out Cleary's latest onboarding assessment tool. It offers in-depth analysis and customized recommendations to enhance every aspect of your employee onboarding, from pre-boarding to company culture integration and more. Whether you're just setting up your onboarding program or you're a CHRO at a Fortune 100 company, this assessment can improve your onboarding know-how. Check it out at gocleary.com/onboarding-assessment. Again, that's gocleary.com/onboarding-assessment. You can also find the link in the episode notes. Now back to the show.
That's a fascinating journey. So let's zoom way into New Globe and your current experience. Can we talk a little bit about what it means to do global onboarding? And because it is obviously a global company. So what are some of the key differences or challenges associated with onboarding within a global context versus one country?
I think it isn't maybe specific to onboarding, but anytime you're working with a multicultural workforce, there's always going to be a variety of communication styles, right? There's also going to be a spectrum of trust. When you're looking at communication styles, decision making, trust, there's actually this really phenomenal book called The Culture Map by Erin Meyer that I recommend folks check out, 10 out of 10. And she walks through these spectrums. Typically, in this part of the world, you might see folks lean in this direction versus in that part of the world, they might lean to the other side. So if we take a more tangible example, although the majority of our employees do sit in Sub-Saharan Africa, which is a fairly hierarchical type of cultures in Nigeria, Kenya, Rwanda, Uganda, Liberia, where we operate at New Globe. Conversely, our shared services office in the Netherlands, where our tech team sits, is the exact opposite, right? Where in Dutch cultures, it's very much consensus and workers' councils. When you zoom back into the onboarding of this, and like with most things, you need to make sure you're paying attention to your audience, right? You might need to cater some of your presentation style accordingly and be mindful that we shouldn't be totally leaning into the stereotypes of a country's culture or communication style, but be mindful of that along with individual differences.
That's fascinating. There are different styles across the world. And then there's the other layer that you specifically, you're based in Boston, right?
Yep.
Working on onboarding and leading a people team that is primarily based in Sub-Saharan Africa. I imagine there's logistical and coordination challenges that you're dealing with, all the way to these cultural things that you're working through. So how do you manage those complexities?
Yes, I think at its core, distributed companies for fully remote companies navigating like Australian, New Zealand time zones with American time zones. Those are the trickiest ones in my experience. You have to be prepared to work with counterparts asynchronously, and that's no change in onboarding either. So when I am structuring an onboarding program, and you're probably not shocked to hear that I take an academic approach to it. When I think back to my time in university, you've got your core curriculum classes, right? You've got your math class, your science class, English, some kind of social studies, right? Before you get into your major degree and specialization, at least in the United States. With that in mind, that's like how I like to set up onboarding, because when you've got a new hire coming into an organization, you're going to need to differentiate to tell employees in Nigeria about their HMO and health insurance, and a totally different plan from a PPO that might be offered in the United States. When you have a new hire coming in, you need to make sure that they are being onboarded to understand the company prior to understanding what they're doing in their role, because without that foundational scaffolding, it's going to be a lot more difficult. So how do you make that asynchronous, and how do you look at that distributedly? We utilize recordings of sessions from our leadership team to talk through things like core values, or an intro to our academics function. And then maybe that pivots from our chief academics officer over to our VP of measurement and evaluation, who's evaluating the student outcomes and the data there. And he might walk through that department. And then our VP of instructional design, whose department is creating all of the lesson plans and guides for the teachers in the public schools. We'll share more about that. So that way, throughout these recordings, folks are able to come up to speed pretty quickly on what each part of the company does. So that way they can better understand how their role works into it. I think the other piece of that asynchronous onboarding that's also important is having some sort of intranet, but it doesn't have to be a super fancy tool. Ultimately, you can use a Google Sites page to be scrappy, create pages, highlight all of the normal things like what is our company's referral program and are there referral bonuses? And if I need to be reimbursed for something, where's the form that I need to fill out to get reimbursed for an expense? There's some of those asynchronous elements too, or like how to submit a ticket, to all of these things that come into play with onboarding. I think oftentimes in smaller companies, Notion used pretty heavily as like a kind of like a knowledge base almost, which can also be very useful when onboarding distributed team members and giving them time, in addition to some of that asynchronous work, to have some synchronous conversations, right? Nobody wants to join a new company and just be watching recordings all day and not actually talk to a human. And they're getting some of that human interaction, maybe starting that day with a little coffee or chai chat with their direct manager before diving into some of these more specific departmental learnings. So I think paying attention to some of those things, having some asynchronous, some synchronous, knowing your audience, it would be how we approach it from afar. And that's how we structure things.
Yeah, sounds like asynchronous communication is a big part of it, and using video as a higher fidelity versus just writing is a big part of how you onboard for a logistically complex global time zone, the kind of company where someone's always awake around the world to handle onboarding. I'm curious about your perspective on the role of talent acquisition in onboarding. Does talent acquisition have a role in onboarding?
I think that talent acquisition is important to do some of that expectation setting before day one. When you're looking at onboarding as part of the employee life cycle, there is some pre-onboarding, right? So there's that period where after the offer letter has been delivered and the candidate signs it, and before day one, where sometimes they might send an email touch point to say, hey, really looking forward to you starting next week, or maybe not even the TA team or the HR team, maybe the hiring managers reaching out to just say a word of encouragement, right? Or just checking in, wanted to say hi, to continue some of that engagement before day one. But typically, in terms of the heavy lifting and the core of the role, usually you see that handoff between talent acquisition and the people team after that offer letter has been signed, to where at that point, like what you might consider as traditional onboarding is being taken over by that time of onboarding logistics, and maybe your onboarding schedule is typically coordinated by the people team, right? Also, consideration of company size, right? If you're a startup, maybe you're one person HR team. I was HR, talent acquisition, and IT for a period at ConnectRN. So you just kind of got to pay attention to what you're working with.
Because you've also worked at staffing agencies, right? So if you're comparing a recruiter at a staffing agency versus an in-house recruiter, what is the difference in terms of what you'd expect from that person in terms of onboarding?
It's very cut and dry when working with a staffing agency, and more specifically, we're talking about permanent placement as opposed to temp staffing being an important differentiator here. When a permanent placement external recruiter gets that offer letter signed, you would think that they would be behooved and want to continue that development with the candidate coming in. They might have some touch points, and a smart recruiter will continue to have those touch points. However, they really aren't doing any part of the onboarding life cycle because, quite frankly, they don't really know how because they aren't an employee of that company. They can't speak necessarily as well to the mission, vision, values, the benefits package as somebody who works for that company. They're really a consultant. And so at that point, their job has been, and like it's like a project, right? The project has come to completion once the offer letter has been signed. And when you're working with an external recruiter, you're passing that torch to the internal HR team at that time. Whereas there's a little bit more fluidity for an in-house talent acquisition team where sometimes they might carry that torch a little bit longer in terms of ownership of that candidate soon to be employee, and that handoff and passing of the torch and the relay that is onboarding maybe is a little bit more shared in-house and may have a slightly different inflection point. Although typically the heaviest lift is coming to an end, both for in-house talent acquisition and external recruiters once that offer letter has been signed.
Got it. So then to be explicit, you would also want your in-house recruiters to draw a line at offer accept and move on to the next job rec?
I don't know if want is the right word. I think that it also depends on their pay structure, right? So something interesting about EF and my teacher recruitment there, it was also partially commission-based, even though we were in-house recruiters. We were teacher recruitment and training in the same department. And remember, there wasn't a traditional HR team. I think the structure really worked well for EF because a recruiter had a base salary, and this is, gosh, over a decade ago at this point, right? Going back some time, I don't know their current structure, but at that time for that division of the company, which when I left, there were 16 separately operating divisions. They're just like the world's largest education company that nobody has really heard of. That's like the joke that EF people make. But recruiters got a base salary and then a commission based on how many teachers arrived in the country. And so you would get paid that commission up front once they landed in China, Russia, or Indonesia. However, if that employee didn't make it past the 90-day mark, then that commission got clawed back from your base salary. And in that role, needed to play a heavy hand in the onboarding and training of that person, keeping in touch with them, making sure that they were adjusting culturally. If somebody having trouble adjusting, maybe do I need to hop on a call with them and share my own experiences?
Yeah, so empathizing with the newness of everything for a new employee, especially if they're moving to a new city or country on top of obviously joining a new company. And there's the other layer in this case of just having your first job ever, which is also in and of itself.
Can help with some of that normalizing, right? And that expectation setting. But maybe that's more candidate development to make sure that you're seeing that new hire come to fruition versus what might be classified as traditional onboarding. But I might say it's pre-onboarding.
We talk about a pre-boarding period, which is from offer accept up until day one, which is super important and often one of the biggest things that companies don't optimize for or think about actively. And the baton is stuck somewhere between recruiting, HR, and the manager. And you can already get set up to not be on the right path on day one if you don't get that right. And depending on the role and industry, you hear about ghosting, right? People not showing up on day one or rescinding their offer accept increasingly before actually getting to day one and getting to that connection, which is of course tough. Right. Can we talk about then just doing onboarding in a couple of ways? First, on a shoestring budget, because you worked in different industries, right, where that's the norm and that's what's expected. Let's start there. What are the corners you will not cut and ensure that things work out well? And what are ways that you can still enable it if the budget and what's available on the HR side isn't too high?
If you'd asked me this question at my former employer, I would have had a very different answer than what I do now. So despite being at a much larger and more established company, we are far scrappier in terms of our cost effectiveness because we really operate like a nonprofit, even though we're not technically a nonprofit, although part of the company is. But ultimately, at New Globe, we have over 1,000 employees, and we don't have a global HRIS. Most HR leaders hear that and they're like, oh no, absolutely not. And so I will say it can be done as long as you have G Suite. Google is everything. And we do a lot of work in Google Sheets. I would say utilize Google. Also, Slack can also be a great tool to just make introductions and get folks talking to each other, welcoming the new hire. You can do a lot of like just free and fun interactions with folks in there, whether it be like question of the day, right? So I think using some of those tools to get communication going are really important, making sure that people feel welcomed.
Often the biggest costs are people versus tools in terms of investment in a people team. So if you think about the onboarding program, I'm sure it's a smaller team as well relative to the employee base. So what is the team really focused on in the onboarding world that you think is absolutely critical?
At New Globe, in terms of our HR, we call it people team, department, function structure, we don't have centers of excellence, right? So oftentimes in large companies, you will see folks whose whole job are just dedicated to onboarding new employees. We had that at Cengage, and that was great. But most companies don't have that luxury. So thinking back to ConnectRN, when I said, or hey, I have been given the blessing of expanding from a people team of 1 to 2 people, I was like, all right, where do I need this the most? And at that time, because I knew enough to be dangerous in tech recruiting, but by trade, I'm really stronger on the non-technical side. I said, okay, step 1, I need a senior tech recruiter. And then once we got one more person a couple of weeks later, I said, okay, because we are now scaling like crazy, I need a people coordinator who I didn't need her to be doing interview scheduling. What I did need her to lean into was all of the onboarding logistics. Automation is really the name of the game. And if you aren't thinking about how to automate, whether it be with some of the tools that I've mentioned, obviously AI is very popular right now, and there are a number of platforms, and particularly built into HRIS and HCM systems that will help to eliminate a lot of the administrative burden that previously in ye olden times, right, that HR practitioners had to schlep through with collecting new hire documents and all of that. A lot of that work is being eliminated by automation and AI. Yeah, like new hires cost money, but I think from an HR leadership perspective, you should try to find what you can automate, and automating a lot of those administrative pieces of onboarding is a no-brainer.
Absolutely. We happen to know a thing or two about that here at Cleary. I love that thinking, which is that even when you're as an HR leader, you have that first headcount. When you're in growth mode, you're thinking of a recruiter with the specialty. But then even that second headcount, it's okay. You're investing in automation. It's about getting every single detail of the onboarding process, and then you move on further afield into other processes. Super insightful. So maybe I can ask this one last question about a slightly different area, which is about high volume onboarding, which might be temp workers. I know you've had some unique experience at ConnectRN associated with this. How does that differ, and how would you describe doing that well, where it's high volume, part-time, contract, or potentially even full-time, but just doing this onboarding at this massive scale?
So I'll share a little bit of context about ConnectRN very quickly and what they do as a company, so that way you can understand more of where the high volume onboarding piece is coming from. So ConnectRN has an app that allows nurses and aides across the United States to pick up shifts in home healthcare settings, hospitals, and also skilled nursing facilities. And so when I joined, it was strictly skilled nursing facilities. All of the nurses are per diem. And at that time, I was HR for both the nurses and clinicians, as well as our more corporate team members, like your marketing folks, your engineers, your operations, et cetera. And so the headcount structure that I was talking about was strictly for that corporate office-y type job, as opposed to the clinical onboarding. When I joined ConnectRN, we probably had around 300 actively working nurses. And like I mentioned before, they're per diem. So they were choosing their own hours. They were going into the ConnectRN app to pick up shifts. However, when they go to pick up shifts at these new healthcare facilities, maybe the healthcare facility isn't new, but new to them, they have never worked a shift there before. They will oftentimes have 30 minutes to an hour of a very brief onboarding, usually done by the director of nursing, in order to understand how that particular facility operates, perhaps different from others that they've been at before. However, before you can even get to that part of onboarding on a shift basis, they had to onboard to the ConnectRN platform. And when I joined, we were at 300 actively working nurses. By the time I left in Q1 of 2023, we were over 8,000. And so we had to differentiate between clinician HR and corporate HR. So I ended up moving onto the corporate side, and we had a whole clinician experience team. And part of that clinician experience function included high volume onboarding specialists, where their whole job was not recruiting, right? Because during the pandemic, when I was there, so many healthcare facilities were hurting for nurses. And although we were making sure that all of these nurses and aides had the appropriate paperwork, like nursing licenses based on the correct states, and that they had the appropriate knowledge for their level, whether they're a CNA, a GNA, an LPN, and RN, which were the types of clinicians and nurses that we in particular hired for. We then had to make sure that they got onboarded to the ConnectRN platform. We kind of approached it from more of a SaaS customer onboarding perspective, right? Mm-hmm. Where instead of thinking about, hey, these are our mission, vision, values, and that scaffolding that I talked about before, we instead had to say, hey, you're doing this, picking up these shifts per diem because you want extra money. In most cases, they weren't doing this as a full-time job. So understanding that was an important element, and what was important to them. They needed to know, okay, what do I need to do to get paid? And as soon as possible, right? But we also had to make it super easy and replicable. So once again, utilizing video, having larger group intake sessions, typically via Zoom, right? We might walk through, okay, here's an intro to the ConnectRN app. Here's how you log in. Here's what you do to filter shifts to see what's in your area. Here's how to filter to show maybe if you exclusively want to work night shifts, how you can only show those shifts. So making sure that they were onboarded and understood the user interface and user journey as a clinician through the app. So that way they could not only pick up shifts, but they could also clock in and clock out when they got to the healthcare facility on the app. And when we were doing that training predominantly via video, earlier times, like pre-pandemic, a lot of it was being done on phone calls. But we did see that shift more and more towards Zoom throughout, and we're able to shift our technology accordingly throughout that time too.
Hey, it's Thomas here. Now, you and I might think it's obvious that people are your biggest resource, and investing in your onboarding program to make it world-class is a bet you want to make. But how do you talk about this with your CEO or CFO so that you can get them on board with investing in an updated onboarding program? They're always looking for something that can save money and boost productivity at the same time. Well, I've got something exciting for you. Check out Cleary's onboarding ROI calculator. It's easy to use. Just enter some info about your current onboarding process and your company and see how much time and money you could be saving with a modern onboarding solution. Head on over to gocleary.com/onboarding-ROI to give it a try. See what you learn and let us know what you think. Again, that's gocleary.com/onboarding-ROI. You can also find a link in the episode notes. Now, back to.
Great. So thanks for sharing that. Are you ready for a lightning round of questions then?
Let's do it. Rock and roll.
First of all, is there a piece of advice that you've ever received that's always stuck with you that you'd like to share?
I don't know if it's a piece of advice that I've received, but a life lesson that I have learned and advice that I have imparted to my teams that I often have to remind myself about is control the controllables, because there are always going to be things that you cannot control. Right now, most of the markets that my company works in are in Sub-Saharan Africa. I don't know what their governments are going to do on any given day. Not that I know what the US government's going to do, but like things are always going to be changing, and I can't get myself worked up over things that are not within my control. And so dial it back, simplify, make it bite-sized. What can I do to get myself to be productive instead of spiraling about this change or new policy or legislation or whatever it may be?
That's great. You could start by controlling the pace of your own breath, right?
Yes.
That's wonderful. If you could wave a magic wand and improve the way onboarding is done across the board in all places across the world, what would you improve?
If I truly have a magic wand, I'm 100% going to make teleportation happen. So that way we can get together and do some in-person onboarding, because I guess I'm a geriatric millennial in that I love in-person environments, and being able to like have that energy, at least on the first day, get to know people, have some fun before distributing and going forth. I think it helps to set the stage and get the vibe of folks a little bit better.
But one more fast action kind of question. You're on a plane, or window seat or aisle seat?
Window seat, for sure.
Okay, good. So you're not a maniac.
Your eyes
answer.
lit up like I was like, oh, is he an aisle seat kind of guy? It's okay if you are. It just means I get the window seat, which is fine by me.
There you go. So, well, with all that said, thank you so much for this conversation, Allison. That's a wrap for today's episode of All On Board. I hope you all out there listening found this conversation as valuable as I did, and hopefully there are tips, tricks, pieces of advice in there that you can take into your own onboarding efforts. And so don't forget to subscribe to the podcast, stay updated on the latest tips and trends in all things employee onboarding, and stay tuned for Thomas's take, where I'll share a take or two and my reactions to Allison's great thoughts shared today. And until next time, best of luck to everyone getting folks on board. And remember, it's all about getting those laptops shipped to employees so they have it on day one. Hello, Thomas here. I'm back with my take on this awesome conversation with Allison. A couple of takeaways here. First and foremost, I want to talk about precarious pre-boarding. If there is a point in time that you just had to describe as something that is the simplest area to optimize for, where just a little bit of investment goes such a long way, it's the pre-boarding phase. That period between when a candidate accepts an offer and day one when they start. Now, this could be as little as 24 hours, but often can be a week or two or a month or possibly more. If you're working with an external staffing agency to have this position filled, would you have a recruiter bonus structure or a payment structure contractually that would ensure that you're paying out the staffing agency if the person they hired actually makes it to day one? I would think so. Similarly, if you had an internal recruiting team, you'd want some amount of responsibility on the recruiter and the talent acquisition org on ensuring this person who says they accepted the offer actually show up on day one. Does this happen in practice? Often it gets very muddy and messy, and the handoffs between the recruiter and the manager and HR can be a bit all over the place. Getting this contractually, if you have a bonus structure for your recruiters and talent acquisition internally in place, is helpful, and having them take a bit of a lead role along with the manager in ensuring that there's strong and useful communications happening before day one. But even beyond that, it's important to create a culture where the norm for a great recruiter on the team is to continue communications at least through day one. There is an argument, and there are structures I've seen that actually take this through to day 90, where there's some level of training that is also incumbent upon the recruiter. However, through role specialization, this usually doesn't last beyond any semblance of scale for an HR team. Now, a second concept we heard here that I wanted to talk about was about asynchronous communication in remote onboarding. Remote work in general maps often to asynchronous communication, which is the point of communicating, whether that be the written word, audio, or video, in a manner where both folks do not have to be spending that time live. So written documents, wikis, written messages, for example, on instant messaging tools, although based on the way that your team actually operates, some of those can be thought of as synchronous communication if you have a culture of that. But all of these are examples of asynchronous communication. Recording videos for departments introducing themselves to other departments, or having a leader record a session that they're doing for an onboarding session with folks in the APAC region live, because that's where they're based, but then recording it so that it can be replayed for folks who are getting onboarded maybe in that same week in the EMEA or Americas regions, is a way to do this as well, where you have a combination of synchronous and asynchronous. But generally speaking, it's important to think about how asynchronous communications should be a key part of the toolkit that you're leveraging to ensure that a remote onboarding class really gets up to speed and up to productivity as rapidly as possible. Another concept that came out of this session was how much we can learn about employee onboarding from product onboarding. If you think about any kind of software that you've maybe used, whether it's with your bank or it's something that you used at work, the first time you're logging in, sometimes there will be a tour or the capability for you to quickly learn what it is that you need to do to get to success. If you sign up for a social media account, they will try to get you to tweet, post, follow, or whatever the thing is that you need to do so that you can get to that first loop of success. In a similar way, there are companies that actually tend to be more B2B focused that end up onboarding contractors and people at massive scale. So how does Lyft or Uber onboard drivers, or DoorDash gets dashers onto their platform, or Airbnb gets hosts onto their platform? This is a business relationship, but tends to be a bit more consumery in terms of the amount of scale they need to solve for. And if you take that thinking and some of the constraints that really come with this kind of thinking in product onboarding, and especially in this B2B product onboarding, the constraints are that you have to onboard thousands of people potentially in a given day, week, or month. And so you're going to be thinking about communications and processes that are built to scale. So high quality writing, FAQs, videos, key points that get people from A to B that they need to get to in the first hour or the first few minutes, not to mention the first few days. And this kind of efficiency and way of thinking, if you put that into your employee onboarding versus having something completely concierge-based in terms of your thinking, can actually make you much more efficient and effective in having delivering a great onboarding experience. That's all I had for this one. I'm Thomas, and that was my take. I'll see you all in the next one.